Fine. Okay, Q&A. Yeah. No? Yeah.
To my understanding, a lot of the time, when people talk about opinions or positions in the Gemara, we'd say that two rabbis, that they'd be right at the same time, or they both could be right even if their positions are in disagreement. Is that a thing people say? I don't know.
Okay.
What does that mean?
The question is, there seems to be in the air somewhere a principle that even two contradictory opinions could be right at the same time. How could that be? How can you explain that? Well, I have to explain to you that it's not so. And I have to explain to you a problem, a widespread problem in studying Talmud with many subjects, not just with this particular subject. What happens is this. The Talmud will take a stated position, A, B, C, D, E. And people will be discussing it and arguing about it and analyzing it and questioning it. But A, B, C, D, E is long. It's long, it's hard to remember. And somebody says, you could just summarize it as PQ. I start discussing PQ and analyzing it and defending it and criticizing it, and they forget that the word didn't say PQ. It said A, B, C, D, E. That's what it said. And very often the conclusions they arrive at are conclusions that are correct about PQ, but have nothing to do with A, B, C, D, E. So it's somewhere in the middle of this discussion, you have to ask yourself, but why didn't the Gemara say the words that I'm discussing? Now, the principle that you're talking about is Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. These and these are the words of the living God. That's not what you're discussing. You're discussing they're both true. And you're wondering, if they contradict one another, how could they both be true? But the Talmud didn't say they're both true. The Talmud said, these and these are the words of the living God. Now, they're both true is much shorter, much clearer, much more precise. These and these are the words of the living God. Yeah, okay. I mean, what does that mean and how does it apply? And why is the Talmud waxing into poetry? That should make you suspicious that you're not discussing what the Talmud said. This happens over and over again. In this particular case, there's a wonderful book called The Origins of Dispute in Talmudic Times by Rabbi Tzvi Lampel. He has a chapter on this subject, and he cites 9 explanations of that Talmudic dictum, none of which says two contradictory statements are both true at the same time. Not one. Not one. So it's just discussing the wrong subject. The Talmud does not say that two contradictory statements can be true at the same time. It doesn't. What does Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim mean? Well, the Ritva in Eruvin says something radical. He says that God taught Moses for every issue reasons on both sides of the issue and left the decision up to the court, in this case the Sanhedrin. And when it says these and these are the words of the living God, it means the reasons on both sides that God taught to Moses. All the reasons are words of the living God. The reasons weren't made up, they weren't invented, they weren't misunderstood. All the reasons are, and there are always, on any interesting subject, there are reasons in favor of this side, there are reasons in favor of that side. The reasons in favor of this side are genuine reasons in favor of this side. The reasons on that side are genuine reasons in favor of that side. That's no contradiction. Of course, the decision will be a contradiction if you go one way or the other, but on that it doesn't say they're both words of the living God. Rashi in Ksuba says roughly the same thing, and he says it in a more dramatic way. He says when the Talmudic sages are discussing an issue, debating an issue, and each one brings proofs to his side, all the proofs are genuine Torah material. They are all genuinely part of the words of the living God. But he distinguishes between two kinds of cases. If two students say about their teacher, well, look, he said this and this and this. Now, I think it should be interpreted this way, and I think it should be interpreted that way, and they disagree, he says, that's a reasonable disagreement, and those disagreements occur, and there's nothing sloppy or embarrassing about discussing a disagreement like that. But, Rashi says, if the disagreement is, one student says, the rabbi said X, and the other student says, no, he didn't, he said Y, he said, then one of the two of them is sheker. It's false, it's a lie. And that's already embarrassing. That you have a dispute where one side is definitely wrong, but it happens, it does happen. And Rashi doesn't say these and these are the words of the living God, no. If they disagree about what he said, then only one of them is right, or maybe they're both wrong. Right? They can't both be right, and in that case, one of them is just wrong, sheker. So this idea that the Talmud is committed to, this mystical idea that two contradictory things can be simultaneously right, it's just not what it means. Again, be very careful. In Cheder, when you're teaching a 10-year-old, they're teaching Gemara, there are a lot of pronouns in Talmudic passages. You stop him on every pronoun. What's the reference? And then when you can finish saying the idea which explains the passage, the next step is go back to the passage, read it through, and speak the explanation into the words of the passage to make sure that it fits. And very often when you have these discussions about Talmudic subjects, that exercise is never done. You go back to the original words and say, okay, I say it means this, so this word means this, and this word means this, and this word means this, and that's how it fits into the words. That's never done. That's not exciting. Your heartbeat doesn't go up when you do that. Heartbeat goes when you're proving the other guy wrong, not when you're checking whether the words say it. But that's essential to Talmudic discussion. This is a good example of that kind of thing.
What would be an actual example of, you mentioned sometimes people shorten the point A, B, C, D to, if P then Q. Would that be an example of that?
Well, this is one, right? The Talmud says these and these are the words of the living God, and the shortened version is they're both true. That's right. Here's another one. Anyone who says King David sinned is wrong. There's a much shorter way to say that. King David didn't sin. Isn't that shorter, clearer? Why go around the bush? Anyone who says that he is wrong, why do that? Because he did sin. That's not up for question. The verses say that he sinned. So it's not talking about whether he sinned or not, talking about what's the status of people who say that he sinned. And what the Talmud is saying roughly is people who say that he sinned don't understand what the sin was. So in their minds they have a false picture of what really happened. Doesn't mean to say that he didn't sin, because had they meant to say that he didn't sin, then they would have said he didn't sin, instead of saying anyone who says he sinned is wrong. So this is what happens in these discussions. It gets contracted and compacted and paraphrased, and then the original meaning is lost. Ja, was noch? Yeah.
So when a certain rabbi or someone very holy from the past says that if I need to word the question. There's a certain 10 paragraphs of Gehinom that if a person says from Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, that Rabbi Nachman says he will come into Gehinom and take him out. My question is does that work?
So, okay, the question was this, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov says there are certain 10 chapters of Psalms, tell him, if he says Rabbi Nachman will come and take him out. Now, a lot of statements that are made within a context. When they're taken out of context, they will be not correct and misapplied. Let's see. Suppose there's a person in China who is studying the Hebrew language, and he looks for tricky passages which are hard to pronounce to practice his pronunciation. And he happens to pick up those 10 chapters of Psalms, and he's using them for his pronunciation practice. Is Rabbi Nachman saying he's going to come and take him out of Gehinom? I don't think so. I don't think that's what he meant. A Jew who understands the words, but he's practicing speed reading. Who can read it faster? I remember there was a kid who came to Ashrei in the davening. I think it took him about 13 seconds. I said, you can't say Ashrei that fast. And he said it to me, and he did. He proved it to me, right? So these guys are practicing speed reading. Did Rabbi Nachman mean he's going to take them out of Gehinom? I don't think so. I think he means that people who use this as a vehicle for expressing spirituality, who identify with the words. When they say the words, they mean what the words say. They apply the words to themselves. Those people. And then I have no reason to doubt what Rabbi Nachman said. We just have to understand what he said. By the way, having said that, I want to share with you, it took me a long time to appreciate Tehillim, because I associated Tehillim with poetry. And at least in English poetry, maybe other cultures have it differently, it's a normal expectation. I think that reading the poem will arouse in you certain emotions. And I found that when I was saying Tehillim, even when I understood Hebrew and I understood the words, didn't seem to be very effective in arousing my emotion. It took me years to realize that's not the function of Tehillim. The function of Tehillim is not to cause you to feel things. The function of Tehillim is to give you words to express your feelings. King David, who wrote many of them, no, King David did not write the book of Psalms. The Talmud says clearly there were 10 authors. He edited it, and he wrote many of them himself, but there were many other authors as well. He lived a tumultuous life. He went through a great many of the terrible tribulations and wonderful triumphs that a human being can. And with God's Spirit in him, he composed these Tehillim, so that when you go through various aspects of life and you have feelings, you have words that can express the feelings. So it's not that it causes you to have the feelings, it's give you words to express it when you... So that's an entirely different function. That's for what I at least was looking for when I was confusing it with English poetry. But yeah, I would say under those conditions, I have no doubt to say it, no reason to doubt it.
How would one make sure that when you're trying to improve yourself, that the growth is healthy, as opposed to...
It's a very difficult and very long question. I'll just make a couple of remarks. How can you improve? How can you ensure that when you're trying to improve yourself, that the growth is healthy? First of all, you need to appreciate how broad the scope of improvement is. Most people identify improvement with fixing things that are wrong. That's only one dimension of improvement. Another dimension of improvement is things that you're already doing right to do better. There's a gigantic difference between the two of them, because there's a tremendous psychological resistance to working on the things that are wrong. Because then you have to feel guilty. You have to feel that you're a failure. You have to feel there's something wrong with you. Whereas, if it's a question of improving things that you're already doing right, you feel good about yourself, you feel happy with yourself, and you think, I could even be better. And of course, that psychological resistance deflects you, distracts you, saps your strength and your application. And since self-improvement benefits from inertia, that is to say, if you start moving forward, the fact that you're moving forward carries you to the next step, like physical inertia. It's a wise thing to start with things you're already doing well, and to think about improving them, rather than going headlong into the places where you feel that you're failing. Think about your practical life. What do you invest in? Things you do well, things you do poorly. What you do is you try to gerrymander your life so the things you do poorly won't come up, so that you can spend your life doing the things you do well, so you can be a bigger success, right? Don't think of correcting the things that are wrong, just avoid them. So that's one thing. In the context of self-examination, what's called cheshbon nefesh, I asked my Rebbe Zatzal, who was a Rebbe, about that sort of practice. He said it's definitely worthwhile. He didn't command me to do it, but he said it's definitely worthwhile. But he said with one condition. When you start to review your day or your week or your month, you think about what you did, start by finding something that's good, that you're proud of, dwell on it, meditate on it, polish it till it glows, and then turn your attention to things where you might need to improve. And because maintaining a justified positive self-image is very important. The second thing I would say is this. In sports, they tell you if you have a doubt whether the next step in training is something that you can accomplish, don't take it because you're risking injury. And if you're injured, you can't train at all. So you're better off erring on the side of caution where you slow down your training development so as to make sure you don't cause an injury. I think the same type of principle applies here. When you take a step forward, if you manage to make the step forward and everything else about your life accepts it without deteriorating, then it'll be a successful step. If it fails or it causes failures in other parts, and you have to rethink and maybe take a step back, that's an interruption in the forward flow. That doesn't have to totally derail you, but it will definitely slow you down. It's like an injury which causes an interruption in your development. So my advice is always to make sure, as best you can, no one can be omniscient, but to make sure as best you can that the step you want to take is a step that you can manage, and you'll be able to control it, and you'll be able to integrate it into what you're doing. One more remark I will make, and then I'll go on to the next question, because it's a very big topic. People, especially people from a frum background, don't appreciate that it is appropriate to subdivide progress. That is to say, if there's a certain area which needs help, either because I'm failing, I'm doing something that's against halacha, or what I'm doing is of inferior value, there's no reason to take an all or nothing attitude. It's perfectly permissible to divide it into stages. So, for example, a person who's considering kashrus, if he says, look, kashrus is a big deal, and there's a lot of details and so on. I've surveyed it. I could handle biblical kashrus, but rabbinic kashrus I can't handle. Is it okay, Rabbi, if I start with biblical kashrus? No more lobster. No more bacon cheeseburgers, right? But unsupervised milk products and that sort of thing, or where the truest mice are derabbanan and things like that. I'm not ready for that yet. So now, the thought that makes him hesitate is the thought of hypocrisy. If you say you believe in something and you don't do it, that means you're a hypocrite. What am I saying? I believe in kashrus, I think it's important, but I'm not doing all of it. Doing half, not the other half. Doesn't that mean I'm a hypocrite? The answer is no. It's a wrong definition of hypocrite. A hypocrite is not someone who says he believes it and doesn't do it. A hypocrite is a person who says he believes it and isn't faithfully trying to do it. But he may be faithfully trying to do it and not yet succeeding. He's not a hypocrite. The person who says, I think kashrus is important, but I can't take it on all at once, so I'm going to subdivide it, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. And the same with Shabbos. I once met a guy in America who was in the 40s, family, experienced Shabbos. He thought it was a wonderful, wonderful thing. So I said to him, well, are you going to at least try to incorporate it into your life? He said, Rabbi, it's hopeless. I said, why? Because Saturdays are for golf. I said, really? I mean, golf is more important than Shabbos? No, Rabbi, you don't understand. My job is to negotiate contracts with other companies. Contracts are negotiated on the golf tours. That's when you go and play 18 holes of golf, and in the 15th hole you have a drink, and by the 17th hole you sign the contract, and I'm on the golf course 2 or 3 Saturdays a month, because that's my job. So I said, well, what about the 4th Saturday? Oh, that I could do. Then do 1 Saturday a month. Now don't make a mistake. Shabbos is every Saturday, period, without any exceptions. But he can't do all of that. Or at least he believes he can't do all of that. That it's perfectly appropriate to subdivide and go at it step by step. You'll say, well, maybe he really could, and he's being too lenient on himself. Maybe. But first of all, he's 25% ahead already. And being 25% ahead will give him more incentive to look for ways to manage more, because he'll become used to it and it'll become reinforcing. And the fact that he doesn't do everything he could do doesn't mean that the amount that he does is worthless. He's doing it because he wants to get there. he's not making an intellectual mistake. I forget what they call it. He's not making an intellectual mistake that because I can't do it, it can't be right, or can't, poor God didn't know about golf. If he had known about golf, he for sure would have changed the Shabbos rules so he could play golf. No, that's idiocy. But it's realistic to say I can't do all of it all at once, and it's going to take me time. That's perfectly legitimate. That's another way to make progress in a way that's legitimate.
Should he feel ashamed for the times that he doesn't keep Shabbos then?
As I
Instead
say,
of only keeping it once a month, should he feel ashamed for the other times, the 3 weeks out of the month that he's not keeping it? Shame or guilt, I guess.
I guess that would depend upon whether he believes he's making an honest effort. Let me give you the philosophers like far out examples to make the point. The Vilna Gaon learned Torah 16 hours a day on a bad day. A good day was 18 hours a day. Now, how should I feel about the fact that I don't learn Torah 18 hours a day? Should I feel like a failure? I don't think so. Because I didn't come from the background that he came from. I don't have the natural gifts that he has. And I wasn't the head of a community which gave him support. So I'm doing the best that I can, starting from where I'm coming from with my capabilities. He did the best that he could do given his capabilities. But the outcome is not going to be the same because we don't have the same capabilities. Maimonides says that because we have free will, every person could be as righteous as Moses. Really? Rabbi Nachman writes that if Rabbi Nachman, tried to serve God with all its capacity for 1,000 years, he wouldn't come up to Moses' ankles. So what does Maimonides mean when he says that you could be as righteous as Moses? The answer is that your righteousness is not measured by what you do, it's measured by how hard you try. If you've tried your hardest and the rest you don't accomplish, it's not your fault. Notice I didn't say you weren't obligated. We don't believe in Kant here. But it's not your fault. You don't deserve any penalty for that. So, he says, when it says as righteous as Moses, it means just as he used all of his capacities with all of his energy to serve God, so you too could use all of your capacities to serve God with all your energy, and you'll be equally righteous. The outcome won't be the same because you're not starting with the same capacities. That's a crucial idea. Yeah.
Sometimes there's a machloket Rishonim where there's a very minority opinion, and there's a very majority opinion, and like the Rishonim, it seems to be that they side with the majority opinion.
Does it what? They what?
They seem to side with the majority opinion.
Who's they?
Like the general Rishonim, most of the Rishonim. And sometimes I hear some rabbis saying I hold like that very minority opinion, even though it's been vast majority of the rabbis over the past few hundred years have not sided with it.
I thought you started with the Talmud. Didn't you start by citing the Talmud? No, okay. So now we have a disagreement of Rishonim. Okay.
Rishonim, yes.
Medieval commentaries. The vast majority hold one way, and a small minority holds the other way. And later generations say that we're going to decide with a small minority.
With the vast majority on the other side, like the vast majority, they'll side with that. And then I hear some rabbis from today saying that they I hold like that minority opinion.
Right.
And sometimes I just wanted to know what's the Gedolia or what's our view on I sometimes hear that and I wonder what's our view on that. Like they side like the very minority opinion, and I'm like, I don't see the Gedolia Ador siding with that opinion, and nor do I see the Gedolia Ador over the past few hundred years siding with that.
Okay, so the case is quite complicated now. 800 years ago, there were 30 of the great rabbis who took positions on this subject. 25 took one way and 5 took the other way. In the intervening 600 years, everybody went with the 25. And then 600 years later, 700 years later, a few said, we'll go with the 5. That's what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. So, first of all, majority rule applies only in the Sanhedrin. Only in the Sanhedrin. When you don't have a Sanhedrin, a person, a Gottleib, one of the leaders of the generation, can be a minority of one. He doesn't have to give in to the. The Satmar Rav, the Gottleib bracha, was very much against Agudas Yisrael on this ground, because you take votes and you force the minority to do what the majority is doing. That's only for a Sanhedrin. If you don't have a Sanhedrin, you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. Now, if in 500 years no one has cited the minority opinion, then you have to say, well, all of these generations rejected it. Okay. That's not binding. But it means that if you're going to side like them, you'd better be one of the leaders of your generation. It's not a question of picking and choosing the one that you happen to like because it suits your circumstances or it's beneficial for you, but someone who's the leader of the generation and who could say, no one ever voted against this opinion, no one ever disqualified it, and I think that now is a time. I'm convinced that that's something which needs to be accepted, needs to be applied. There's no legal bar for him doing that. There's no legal bar for him doing that. Any generation can disagree with any earlier generation, except when the Talmud decides a law with the word hilchasa. Aside from that, any later generation can disagree with any earlier generation. So the passage of time does not disqualify. In principle, someone today could disagree with the Rambam. Nothing barring that. And indeed, in the last couple of 100 years, you had people who did that sort of thing. So these are not things that are impossible. Just that I say you would have to be one of the leaders because people would say to you, what possible reasons could you have and could you be confident of that outweigh 500 years of scholarship plus the 25 versus 5 who were against it, right? Who are you to make a decision like that? Usually, the counsel of wisdom, even in non-religious affairs, is a subject that's complicated, and you're investigating it. You at least consult with the greatest scholars and find out what they say. And if not a single one of the greatest scholars would side with you, you wouldn't take the position. You wouldn't do it in surgery. You wouldn't do it in geology. You wouldn't do it in Shakespeare studies. So why would you think that over here you can, play the game as you wish? Just be very foolish and irresponsible. But I wouldn't say that it would be legally impossible.
Even if he's a big Talmud Chacham and everything, let's say he's a big Talmud Chacham, he's not, let's say someone, I'm not saying in specific, I'm saying in general, let's say someone would be a big Talmud Chacham, not one of the leaders of the generation, but big Talmud Chacham. And knowing what he is, says, I can hold this because I'm, I...
So now we're in a gray area. How big is he, and how much was the gap between him and the leaders, and so forth and so on. And I would say this: if he didn't consult with the leaders, then he's irresponsible for sure, because he might be making a mistake. And he's not one of the leaders, it means he's not as big as they are. So if he's not as big as they are, the very first thing you have to do is go to them and say, look, last 500 years nobody's taken this position. I'm thinking of taking this position. What do you have to say to me? Right? If he didn't do that, then I would say he's irresponsible as a person. Again, I wouldn't say that the law forbids him from doing it, but I would say doing it in that way is irresponsible. I wouldn't trust him for anything. I wouldn't trust him for a glass of milk because he's an irresponsible person. Yeah.
I read the Rav's essay about how the Ravs became religious on his website, and first of all, thanks for the very interesting read. The Rav wrote that those who think that religion necessarily requires an irrational leap of faith are simply applying non-Jewish ideas to Judaism. The question is, so what is the right Jewish way to look at this situation?
Okay, so that's a very big question. Yeah, no irrational leap of faith. I wrote a book called Reason to Believe. It's only 300 pages long. And there's another 150 pages on my website, which they didn't let me print because it was too long. So it's 450 pages, and I would recommend that as casual reading over the next 2 or 3 days. And you can get a picture of it. But I think in order that statement shouldn't sound just a foolish statement, you have to pay attention to the various different ways in which something can be reasonable. Some people artificially define reason in a very narrow way. I have to know and understand the reason and see that it's true and it applies. Well, frankly, that's not the way you live your life. That's not the way you apply reason to your life. When you take a medicine because the doctor prescribed it, do you know why you're taking the medicine, what it does. Have you studied the pharmacology and the physiology and the statistics on diseases and so on? No, you have not. When you're negotiating a contract and the lawyer says, don't sign that clause. Why? Because he told me not to sign it, and he's a lawyer. He knows if I sign it, I'm going to lose my shirt. Why are you going to lose your shirt? I don't know. He's trained to know those things, and I trust him. I pay him a good salary to make sure that I don't lose my shirt. You do lots of things where you don't know. You have authorities who have earned credibility because of their knowledge, because of their intelligence, because of their faithfulness in the way they apply things. So, for a person to say, well, unless you know the reason for each thing individually and understand it to the bottom, then you're not being, you're taking a leap of faith. No, I'm trusting people who've proven their scholarship, proven their fidelity, proven their brilliance, and when it comes to the point where it goes to where I don't get it, I trust them. The two examples that I like are you're in your junior year of college and your major's under control and you need a few more courses to fill in your schedule. You're going around listening to lectures to try to pick a couple of courses that you might be interested in. And you stop into a lecture and you hear the professor saying, in this course we're going to study infinity. In particular, we're going to learn about infinities of different sizes, larger and smaller infinities. Oh, larger and smaller infinities. That's gobbledygook. That's nonsense. This guy's either on drugs or he's a phony. That can't be. I'm going to the administration, tell them, fire this guy. He's talking nonsense, absolute nonsense. Bigger and smaller infinities? Come on, wake up. Then he goes into another class. In this class, we're going to be learning about cause and effect, in particular cases where the effect comes first and the cause comes afterwards. What? The effect first? I mean, the effect has to be made by the cause, so doesn't the cause have to be there beforehand to make it? Well, Richard Feynman and John Wheeler said no. So, of course, no one's going to go to the administration. What they're going to say is, these guys are professors, and they're paid by the university, and they've written textbooks, and they have tenure. They must know what they're talking about. And indeed, they do. I taught transfinite mathematics, so I know it's right. And I have studied the quantum mechanics, so I know something about the causation. So you hear it, and you say, if they're teaching it, it's got to be right, even though to me, it sounds like nonsense. And that's rational. So when I talk about no irrational leap of faith, I mean to include this kind of reason supporting what you do, not your own detailed understanding in the particular case and understanding that it's true and why it applies. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what we talk about rational behavior, right? which includes trusting established authorities. In that sense, there's no irrational leap of faith. No. Yeah.
Just another question on the last point. In the Rabb's book, you mentioned the Kruger argument and the argument on survival. Sort of interest, is it the reason you don't mention the other classical arguments you normally see, like from design, logical arguments, stuff like that? Is that because it's not selective, or just because you feel that they're not such strong proofs?
Like, which other ones?
Argument from design.
Oh. Why don't I mention the classical philosophical arguments for the existence of God in my book? No, it's not because of anything against those arguments, but first of all, they're very controversial. And number two, even if they are correct, you still don't have to keep kosher. All they do is demonstrate that the universe isn't self-explanatory. There must be something behind it, which is responsible for its existence and which has intelligence and so on and so on. That's all. I'm interested in someone's having reason to accept the Torah, not the bare existence of God. So I'm not commenting on them, as I say, because they're controversial, because they don't, even if they work, they take off part of the burden of proof, but they don't get you to the end. I want to get you to the point as to say that I have reason to think that the Torah is true, not that it just is a God, but not because I think that it's something against it. Yeah.
I'm just curious, what's the role of the Torah? Like, how do we understand the Torah in the Torah? Like, what was context?
What's this word?
Datura.
Atura?
Datura. There is this substance that appears like datura.
A Torah. You mean the crowns on the letters? I don't know what you're talking about.
No, the datura is like a plant or something. Datura.
A plant?
Yeah. Not really.
Datura, atura.
Datura.
You have to show me the word. I don't understand the
Okay,
word that you're saying.
have to find it.
And I don't know much about plants, so I probably don't know the answer.
Right.
Yeah.
What would you say is the
Sorry.
right thing to do or to do nothing if I were to say make the wrong after bracha on my food, whether it was I had a mazanas and I accidentally said berei nafshas and forgot the al hamechia, or if I ate like a fruit that wasn't a product of Israel and then I still made the al parat on it.
Look, I should have mentioned, I should mention this from time to time, I'm not well trained in halacha, in practical halacha. So if you ask me a question about halacha, if I happen to know the answer, I'll be happy to tell you, but often I'm going to have to say I don't know the answer. Now, to the second question, I don't know the answer, but if, for example, you ate a piece of cake and you say berei nefashos on it, you have to go back and make al hamechia. That's for sure. But if you put in the possessive for plants, for let's say wine of Israel, when it wasn't a wine of Israel, my guess is you don't have to go back. I'm not sure. I really am not sure. You have to ask somebody who knows halacha well. Yeah.
Going back to what you said about being judged on your efforts, in the sense of Shabbat kashrut, are you saying that like Hashem judges you on your efforts? And if that's what you're saying, then how does that tie into the fact that in the Torah, Gemara, we have specific punishments for chets?
Okay. So first of all, I'm quoting The Way of God by Luzzatto. At least 3 times in that book he says, reward and punishment coming from God are only in terms of effort. Now, you ask, well, then how can there be specific punishments for crimes? The answer is, almost all of those punishments are for deliberate violation. It means you could have done better and you chose to do worse. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about a person who can't do any better. Not choosing to do worse. He's just helpless. Like me, when I come to hour 6 of learning, I have to take a rest. I'm not choosing to be frivolous with my time, but I can't do what the Vilna Gaon did. There's no punishment for that. Those punishments are for deliberate violation. So we're not talking about deliberate violation here. Yeah.
And where does the Zohar actually come from?
The Zohar. The Zohar, a lot of people think that Rabbi Yishim Bar Yochai wrote the Zohar. That's not correct. Rabbi Yishim Bar Yochai had a yeshiva where they discussed Nistar, or Kabbalah. And he assigned one of his students, Rabbi Abba, to record and edit those discussions. So Rabbi Abba is to the Zohar roughly what Ravina and Avashi were to the Talmud. They took existing material and they edited it and put it together in a certain structure. Rabbi Abba did the same thing for the discussions in the Talmud. He put them into a combined book form. Right? So there are many speakers in the Zohar. Some are anonymous, some are identified as various Tanoim. Then they have discussions. There are some long passages which are just simply essays that are written there. It's a mixed bag. But it comes from the time of Rishon Bar Yochai. It was kept oral and secret. Only a very few, a small percentage of people were given the privilege of carrying it through the generations until Moshe Dayan in the 14th century published an edition of the Zohar. But that's what it is.
What would be the reason we accept it necessarily as true? As in the Torah, you can see throughout the ages it's never changing. You have many copies to compare with, so you can see there's no additions, subtractions, or let's say fraudulent additions. Whereas in the Zohar, it's been hidden the entire time around them. How do we know all of it's accurate recording of what was passed down?
Look, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi compiled the Mishnah from hundreds of years of scholarship before him. It was not written down anywhere. And by the way, some say that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi didn't write it down either. He just composed the text. It wasn't written down pencil and paper. Indeed, that's why you have in the Gemara, Tana, Taf Nun Aleph, refers to a member of the yeshiva who would recite these things by heart, and you'd push the button and say, recite that stuff. Rattling it off, right? They discuss it, and sometimes the Rosh Yeshiva would say, that's a mistake. Your girsa, your memorized text is mistaken. Change it this way or change it that way. It wasn't even. So you say, well, gee, if it wasn't written down, how do we know that that's genuine? We have to know the kinds of people you're talking about, what kind of capabilities they had, how careful they were with this, what role it played in their value system and in their culture and in their system of authority and prestige and all the rest. And then you form an understanding of that. And where you do have doubts is where you have variant texts. In the Talmud, there are many, many variations. On each page of the Talmud, there are at least 4 commentaries that deal with textual variants. And some, in the Yerushalmi, the textual variants are gigantic. In Bavli, they're mostly, almost all minor, but they're there. So we know that certain things weren't preserved perfectly. We know it because we have variant texts. So I haven't studied the Zohar in that kind of detail. I imagine that there are variant texts as well, but not nearly as much. But the fact that something is preserved orally, from our point of view, a great deal of information was preserved orally. And again, you can measure the reliability by asking how much became controversial and how much didn't. The vast majority did not become controversial. Yeah.
So what you were saying is huge variations in the text before. Is that relative to the stuff that typically, you also did like a lot of it isn't controversial. So is that relative, the variations relative to that saying where most of what we have seems to be accurate, at least an accurate historical line to, when it was first given in Har Sinai, and then that those variations, they're there, but for the most part they make up such a small and encompassing part of it, or the variations make up a large enough amount of it where it seems to be that there are some parts of it that seem to be untrustworthy in that chain?
Well, if you have different opinions about a particular subject, then one possibility is that in transmitting that information, something got lost or something got misunderstood. So, it's not a question of going beyond the particular piece of information, but you definitely have reason to think that for that particular piece of information, the transmission was a failure. In the Gemara, you have a very dramatic statement that's made sometimes about Mishnah and often about Brises. It says, Mishabashta. Mishabashta means it's mixed up, confused. And what it means is, this is really quite a striking thing. What it means is this: the Amoraim are discussing this text which comes from the period of the Tanoim, and they analyze it and criticize it, and they say they have reason to believe that the transmission was not accurate. Why? Because the text does not withstand criticism. It creates contradictions and violates rules in such a dramatic way, the transmission could not be accurate. And then they suggest ways of changing the text so as to recover the original meaning. Now, I think this is important because I could imagine someone saying, what are you talking about? The holy Tanoim. How could you possibly challenge anything they gave in the Tanoim? You say you know it couldn't be accurate? Maybe it's accurate and it contains a meaning you don't understand. You haven't discerned their meaning. Who are you to judge that it isn't accurate? But they did. They did, and they rejected it, and they said that it has to be understood in a different way. That means we know that the transmission of this particular piece of text was not an accurate transmission. Now, well, why should I spread that to something else, right? Which is not controversial, right? Where it's controversial, I have a reason to think that maybe that's the explanation. Where it's not controversial, there's no reason to think that.
I'm sure I asked you, obviously maybe not percentage-wise, but how much of it do you think is controversial, or would be considered controversial out of all the, all the world?
Well, it's a little difficult to talk. It's like the Rambam on various mitzvahs. It's not a question of how many or percentage. It's a question of what size issues are we talking about. For example, there are many cases where questions arise where it may very well be the case that by the time the question was raised, the actual event never happened. They pick out things which are so rare and so unlikely that there's no settled law on the subject because it never happened, so it was never discussed, it was never codified. So it's a question of the kind of detail that's concerned. So the example that I usually give is this. When does Shabbos end? Well, when there are 3 stars in the sky. Any 3 stars? No, sort of medium size. Anywhere in the sky? No, they have to be sort of close together. Okay, sort of, and the medium, how big is medium, and so forth and so on. And there are actually different opinions, which vary to about, let's say, an hour of time or an hour and a quarter of time when Shabbos ends. Look at that. They don't even know when Sabbath ends. That's right. But let me tell you something. There's one great world religion which has in it about 1.5 billion people who put the biblical Sabbath on Friday. You probably heard of them. They're Muslims. And another one, which used to have 2 billion, now there are a lot of post-Christians, who put the biblical Sabbath on Sunday. That's a big difference of opinion. Compared to that, an hour here or there is small change. So we say, well, this is 1, and that's 1, so it's 1 and 1. No, this is 0.0001, and that's 16, and that's how they compare, the single issues. So you have to measure the size of the issue, the importance, the centrality of the issue, right? That has to go into calculating the significance of the variation. Something that happens very seldom, or something that's based on a very tiny detail, is much more likely to become controversial than something which is important and central. Between the Eastern Orthodox Church and Western Christianity, the difference in the calendar. They don't have the holidays on the same days of the year. That's a big difference of opinion. Yeah. Listen. Yeah.
So, are they coincidences that exist? I must say the word coincidences that exist. So even ones that can lead people to, let's say, finding Hashem. I know a lot of times people say, "Oh, coincidences don't exist." Is that an opinion that we would hold?
So it's a little tricky. I worked on this and I couldn't get to an answer. Is every fact planned? Every fact of the world. Take a Torah scroll. Okay, you have all the words, the letters, the spaces, and so on and so on. In this particular Torah scroll, if you take this letter over here and this letter over here, they're exactly 16 inches apart, and the angle is exactly 41 degrees. Was that planned? Also? How about the exact amount of ink for each letter? This has this amount, this has this amount. Were all the amounts of ink also planned? All this under Kosh Baruch Hu's control? Or are some things, some facts, simply non-significant? For Kosh Baruch Hu's purposes for the world, it doesn't matter whether it happened this way or that way. From the point of view of his purposes. Now, you say, well, God has an infinity of computing power. Couldn't it be that they're all significant? Yeah, I think from the point of view of computing power, it could be, but I have no reason to think that they are. Question is not what's possible. Anything other than a contradiction is possible. Question is, what do I have reason to think is likely? And given other considerations that I have about the fact that God could accept various different alternatives equally leading to the same pre-programmed end. So I'm inclined to think that there are real facts that could be different and would make any difference whether they were different. Especially the way God treats animals and providence. I'm writing something on that. Okay. And now you're talking about coincidences, the kind of coincidences that would attract our attention. So, how? Look at that. He did this, and then he did this, and then he did that. I think that it would be fair to say something's going on here. But the jump from something's going on here to Q is going on here is a gigantic jump. And usually that jump is made irresponsibly. Usually you have no reason to pick Q. And if you use your imagination just a little bit, like 30 seconds, you could think that Well, Q, but what about R, X, Y, and Z? Maybe you could one of those, or A, B, and C. You can think of alternatives very easily. And then you'll see that you have no reason to accept one over the other. When I first came to this yeshiva, I had two very disconcerting experiences. One was a guy who came into the yeshiva and he said, Rabbi, it happened. I was on my way to town. I went to the bus stop. Just as I got to the bus stop, the bus pulled away, and I realized God doesn't want me to go to town. I said, really? That's what you realized? Maybe there was somebody in the next bus you had to meet? Like, who says it's because he didn't want you to go to town? And the worst one was, the guy says, give me mazel tov. Why? I just got engaged. Wow, mazel tov, you got engaged. Who's the girl? Listen, Rabbi, she and I were in kindergarten together 16 years ago. And our last names both begin with L. And I just met her at the bus station. We're engaged. At which point I withdrew my mazel tov. And then 3 weeks later when they broke up, I gave them a mazel tov. So are these things that catch your attention accidental? Probably not. Because God runs the world and crafted our minds so that our minds can pick up the significant features of the world. If we didn't have that pre-programming in our minds, we'd all be dead. Because anything that happens to you, try to figure out what the trend is or what the rule is, there's always an infinity of different possibilities for the rule that you just discard because your mind is not crafted to find them. This is the puzzle that good philosophers of science know. How do we ever understand anything about the universe? It's got to be because our minds are pre-programmed to think in certain particular ways which fit what the universe is doing. So that if something happens and catches our attention, I think it's fair to say that it's something that God programmed in, but it's like walking down to the newsstand and looking at the Beijing Times. You see those chicken tracks all over the paper, and you think, that definitely says something, but I haven't a clue what it says. I think that's the attitude we have to have for most of the things that happen to us. There's definitely something, there's a reason for it, but it's not given to me to understand what the reason is. The only exception is where if the action happens, the event happens, and it triggers a halacha, then I can say one reason why God made it happen. Yes, the one is important. One reason is to get me to do that because the halacha says when this happens, that's what this halacha tells you what to do. That's fair. But other than that, you have to say God is running my life, and these things happen. And I submit to it. And I say I put my life in your hands, and I trust you that you'll do for me what is the best thing for me. Yeah.
So going along the lines that there's there's a reason for everything that happens. There's like another idea that everything that happens is for like the best, right? Hashem makes it for the best. Is it possible to have something that Hashem does for the best, but may not necessarily be for your individual best?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. Everything Hashem does for the best, but it might not be for your individual best. I think that's right. And by the way, you put the question very well. Let me just point out, best is a comparative judgment, and comparative judgments are very weak. In particular, something might be best and be bad, because it's the least bad of all the alternatives. So it's better than all the other alternatives. It might still be bad. But okay, so the fact is that you're living in a world of relationships, and you don't live as an isolated person. And sometimes the way you're related to another person can determine the outcome for you in a way that if you weren't related or weren't in the presence of that person, it wouldn't be for you. So I'll just give you one example, which probably is part of what you're thinking about. If one person can use his free will, and God is committed to free will, that it should exist and should operate, and he's going to use his free will to hurt somebody else. Now here's the question. Let's say A uses his free will to hurt B. Should we say, well then B had it coming, because God's running the world, and he's fair, and he's a just, he has justice, and therefore, if B got hurt, then he needed to get hurt. It was right that he get hurt, which would mean that even if A and B hadn't met, even if they hadn't come into interaction with one another, so B would have been struck by lightning because he needed to have that happen to him. That's not, at least it's not an accepted Jewish view. There may be some who have it, but it's not an accepted Jewish view. On the contrary, what happens to B can depend upon the fact that he's interacting with A. And God has a commitment to A's free will. And the principle here shouldn't be too surprising. Let's suppose you have a parent, and a parent who's failing in various ways, but he has children who need him. You would understand very well if we said, well, according to the way he's acting, God should end his life, but because God wants his children to be provided for, he preserved his life. You wouldn't have trouble with that. He's doing to A something because of his children, right? So we wouldn't. Let's say this person's a king, and he has certain weaknesses, but the weaknesses are going to cause destruction for the kingdom. So God might relieve him of those weaknesses, or in some way compensate for those weaknesses to protect the kingdom, not because of him. We don't find that surprising or difficult, that God will behave to one person because of relationships with other people. This is how many Meforshim explain what happened with Ruvain and Yosef. When Yosef was coming, the brothers wanted to kill him, and Ruvain said, throw him in the pit. And the point of it, say many commentators, is that if he's thrown in the pit, he'll survive. Ruvain knows this, or it's one of the possibilities. If he's thrown in the pit, he'll survive. And even so, if the brothers try to kill him, they'll succeed in killing him. Now, if he's going to survive in the pit, that means God doesn't want him dead. If you take him alone, in isolation, God doesn't want him dead. But Yosef, whom God doesn't want dead, if the brothers try to kill him, they will succeed in killing him. Because up against their free will, Joseph's merit isn't enough. If it's a choice between Joseph's merit and his life versus preserving their free will, both of which are desiderata for God, free will trumps it, and he will die. Not always does this work, but sometimes it does work. So here's a good example of what you're saying, that because you're in a relationship with somebody else, something happens to you, which, were you not in that relationship, it wouldn't happen to you. We do accept such things. It's a long story, but I have to go teach upstairs. Stay with me.